I'm pretty sure if you make Souls content on YouTube, you're legally obligated to do this at some point. But here it finally is. My Soulsborne plus Sekiro plus Elden Ring, whatever you want to call it, From Software boss fight tier list. And just for context, I've been playing these games ever since Dark Souls 1. I've done all kinds of challenge runs like no healing, no leveling, humble brag, etc, etc. So I got quite a bit of experience with a lot of these fights. And just like with every tier list, this one is objectively correct. So if you disagree with these opinions, you are wrong and you have to change your opinion. Sorry, I don't make the rules, that's just how it is. So without further ado, I think we can get started since this is gonna take a while. I took out some of the, let's say, basic enemies or not even boss fights. Like these guys are not even bosses. These are almost basic enemies or just like pretty common non-special bosses. But I did order these like per game. Like these are the basic enemies of Bloodborne. These are the little mini bosses from Elden Ring. But just for like context, like Crystallians are trash as well. And like Agil is at, or the dragons in general are at best like okay. So that's pretty much the range where all of these fall, between trash and okay. But speaking of trash, we have the king of garbage here, Bed of Chaos. You know it's bad when Miyazaki himself basically apologized that this exists. And they probably should have also apologized for Ludden Zolan, the two cats from the Crown of the Ivory King DLC. Literally just a copy-paste of the same fight within the DLC. This time there's just two. It's at the end of the worst area with the worst runback. And it's a DPS check at the same time with no thought put into how the gank fight works. Really fucking bad. King Allant is mostly just disappointing. This guy, if he didn't have a health bar, I'd be more fine with him. But since he pretends to be a boss, I'm gonna treat him as such, and he's trash. He has no moves. Royal Rat Authority is like an insult to Sif, and also the human race. Like, why did they put those toxic dogs in? This fight is just questionable in every way. Traveling Magus, the pinwheel of Dark Souls 2, literally just a weak mage and a room full of goobers. That's it. Ancient Dragon and Dragon God are in a pretty similar place for me. Both of these guys are just insanely disappointing dragon fights. Like, they have cool designs and that's all they really bring to the table. Ancient Dragon is just chipping his toes for 10 minutes and Dragon God is just a gimmick fight. Royal Rat Vanguard is just a room full of rats and one of them got a nice haircut. And Moonlight Butterfly floats down, but it doesn't float down often, so you pretty much just wait around while he just flies around and spams you with projectiles while you just either look at him and wait for him to land, or you shoot him with a gun. From trash to bad. Now we're starting off with the Covetous Demon. Basically just Jabba the Hutt, he barely has any attacks. The only reason he's not in trash is that one attack where he can take off your gear, since that's pretty unique. And at least they gave him that. Gank Squad. Basically two different gank squads. I'm gonna cover both of these. The Dark Souls 2 version is generally more annoying, and it's a DLC boss, so you actually had to pay money to even fight these guys. At least From had the generosity to design the room in a way where you can actually kite these guys around. Fierce Champions doesn't offer that luxury, but the NPCs themselves are far less annoying, but both of them basically cover a similar bad purpose. Leechmonger is one of the most nothing fights in the series. It's like the Ouroboros from Resident Evil 5 without Wesker giving cool monologues, and it's just a DPS check, nothing more. Capra Demon and Old Iron King fall in a similar place where I think you're more so fighting something else in the room and not the boss. In the case of the Capra Demon, it's obviously the dogs that From for some reason decided to put in there. And with the Old Iron King, you're fighting that tiny little lava pit. The only reason Old Iron King lands higher, even though I think the pit is more annoying, is that the king himself is more fun to fight than the Capra Demon and doesn't get turned into a basic enemy. Ancient Wyvern, the plunging attack simulator. Or alternatively, you chip his toes for 10 minutes. Again, one of those cases. So you either kill him in a disappointing way or you kill him in a boring way. And right next to him, we got Pinwheel, the other clown that's known for getting one-shotted. You can get a real fight out of this, but you actually have to go out of your way to get it. But even then, like, even if you go to him at the start of the game, he's not too exciting. So I just cannot put Pinwheel any higher in the list, since usually he just explodes and does nothing in most playthroughs. Witch of Hemwick is just kind of strange. You're hunting down the two cloaked little witches, and they almost have no attacks. I think they have like 3. They have a grab, a projectile, and an AoE. And then it's just a wave of mobs. the worst fight in Bloodborne if we don't count the basic enemies from the dungeons. Then right next to him we got the second worst boss from Bloodborne, the Celestial Emissary. This dude rarely gets to even go into phase 2. I don't know why they gave him such low health. Even this picture is misleading. You very commonly don't even see him transform into this, since he actually just dies right away. Gwyndolin is just a projectile spammer that runs away. That's pretty much all there is to say. You'd expect more from a god, but I guess they're the god of running away. I don't know if this is a controversial take, but I've always hated the Man-Eater. Mostly due to them just being glitchy, and they didn't do anything to fix that in the remake, which was one of the biggest disappointments for me personally, since their AI can break in multiple ways during that fight where they just either fly away or get stuck somewhere, and if my rating was based on just the fight itself and nothing more, I'd put it one tier up, but since it's so buggy to this day, I cannot in good conscience put it any higher. Mikolash, the only guy who likes to yap as much as me, is generally, in your first playthrough, a pretty unique experience, but I think he's one of those bosses that every repeat playthrough makes worse. And typically he's just a complete pushover, or he accidentally one-shots you with something you didn't see coming. His funny dialogue doesn't carry him that hard. Half-Light doesn't even get funny dialogue, he gets annoying dialogue in the beginning of the fight, since they wanted to bring back the PvP boss mechanic. But, I don't know, I think there could have been a better way to do this. Having the ads in the room that just heal the invader or the boss just makes this tedious. Adjudicator typically just gets bullied completely, it's very rare to even take damage in this fight. He's very much a nothing boss that I think they already did better in the same game with the Tower Knight. Valiant Gargos is the boss people should be complaining about instead of Godskin Duo, since at least Godskin Duo doesn't have an attack that's nearly invisible and covers half the arena. On their own, each Gargoyle is decent to fight. I prefer the Axe version, but honestly, that poison move alone kills any type of potential this fight could have ever had. The Lost Isolith duo we have here, Centivid Demon and Caesar's Discharge, both disappointing in their own way. One of them is pretty much just standing in lava and you have to wait around for him to get out of that, so the fight is genuinely just pretty boring. And the Caesar's Discharge doesn't really offer anything when it comes to the fight itself. You just whack these little tentacle things when he slams us down, or alternatively, and most likely, you just knock him off the cliff and you skip the fight completely. The Twin Dragon Riders is at the same time weird, since they actually took into consideration that it's a gang fight. At least you can knock down the archer from on top of the tower and you can basically just kill him instantly. But at that point you're just fighting another bad boss 1v1. But it saves it from being lower on the list. Guardian Dragon. The arena in this fight and the way he works by jumping around the little cage is actually pretty cool. And I think it's a big shame that From decided to put these guys as a basic enemy in the very next zone, so this fight gets undermined in minutes. The One Reborn is a boss that you can literally kill in 10 seconds by just DPS racing him to the ground, and that's it. Even if you take your time with it and kill the little spellcasters, like, there's not much else to say about this fight. Ram the Vacuous Spider is pretty much either you getting one-tapped by his minions or you getting one-tapped by his spells. One of those things is probably going to happen if you get hit by him, so this fight can be pretty tedious. At least the arena looks nice. Deathbirds are a fight against the camera more so than anything else, and I've never learned to like these guys no matter how many times I've replayed the game. It's a shame because they look really cool, but they're extremely annoying to fight against. The Dragon Rider is in a weird place since this is like the most generic knight boss from the whole series. His biggest weakness is, I think, also his biggest strength, because I like that you can change his arena by exploring the level. But on the other hand, if you don't explore the level, he can just fall off the cliff and kill himself. So, it's a double-edged sword. But he's pretty bad, though. Just for the sake of convenience, I put all the giants next to each other. Giant Lord and Last Giant are basically the same fight, just twice. I rated the Last Giant higher since his phase 2 with him ripping off his arm is pretty neat, while Giant Lord gets nothing similar. And then we have... Actually, is this a reference to the Last Giant when Fire Giant rips off his leg instead of his arm? But the Fire Giant is just a damage sponge, and if you've ever done any type of a challenge where you're doing low damage, this guy is so tedious to fight against. And once again, it's also just you fighting the camera and you trying to catch the boss when he's running away from you. So there's a lot of things working against this fight. Aldia is mostly just a missed opportunity, since from a story perspective, he's one of the most interesting characters of Dark Souls 2. But his fight is just him hiding behind a wall of fire and spamming spells. I wish this fight was better. Curse Rod at Greatwood There's just something about this fight that I can't really put my finger on it, but I just don't like this. I don't really have a good reasoning why. I've just never found this fight exciting, and every time I have to do it, I find this to be basically the most boring fight of Dark Souls 3, even though I wouldn't say it's the worst fight of Dark Souls 3. High Lord Volnir is a case of having a really cool design, but the fight itself doesn't deliver on his cool aesthetic at all. Like, there are times when he gets to summon his skeletons, but typically you just break his bracelets immediately and he just dies, and that's it. And wrapping up the bad tier, we got the Belfry Gargoyles Dark Souls 2 edition, and they basically just repeated the same fight from Dark Souls 1, but just made it worse and added more gank to it. Slowly going up the list. Next up, we got something less bad, the tier. And starting things off, we have Sir Gideon, the all spamming. I know some people hate this boss, but the one reason why I put him above bad is that I like him doing that long monologue in the beginning, since you can actually just kill him during that. And him getting spells from some of the bosses you kill is a cute touch. If you couldn't kill him and the dialogue was unskippable, this dude would absolutely be in bad tier. The old monk is in a weird place, since I think the idea of the PvP fight carries this fight pretty hard, and I would put it higher based on that. But the NPC fight that you have as an alternative is so bad. The PvP fight can also end up being annoying depending on the opponent. Like, it's a gamble with this fight. But at least you don't have random ads like you do in the Half-Life one. Fool's Idol is kind of like Pinwheel, but I think it's slightly better since she doesn't get insta-killed so easily. But she has almost no moves, and the fight's gimmick ends up being more annoying than anything else. Phalanx is kind of like Rom, but I think it's more inoffensive since it's an early game boss that deals very little damage, and once you actually do kill all the minions, this dude has 0 defenses. You can literally just bully this guy after the minions are gone. So even though Rom is technically a more complex version of this fight, I still prefer Phalanx because Phalanx is just less annoying. The Floating Screen Monkeys is pretty much just a puzzle boss, and it's weird that they put this as a mandatory fight in Sekiro, which is the most focused combat game in the series. But you can actually just rush these guys down and skip the entire puzzle completely. And I'm not sure if that's a negative or a positive, but typically this is my least favorite boss on all my Sekiro playthroughs. The quality of the Undead Giant kind of depends on which version you're fighting. The chain and ball version of him is by far the most annoying, but the other two are alright. So I think generally this guy is just pretty forgettable. Dirty Colossus follows the example set by the Leechmonger by being an incredibly nothing boss in the Valley of Defilement. I think this guy's moveset is mostly just him flailing his arms around and then just shooting bees at you. In a way, I think that's a blessing since the zone before him, it's like the worst in the game. Vendrick is another case of it being like a story fight. You fight the husk of this great, powerful god, but that doesn't make his fight more fun. You're just beating up this weak old man for like 5 to 10 minutes, depending how many giant souls you have, and then suddenly he might one-shot you. I put the Demon Fire Sage and the Stray Demon together since they're basically identical. I value the Stray Demon a little bit more since you fight him when you return to the Asylum, and you do actually see him in the very beginning of the game, while the Demon Fire Sage just feels like a lazy rehash. But they're both just copies of the Asylum Demon, and all they've really added is just magic spam for both of these dudes. The Magma Worm is interesting, since there's just something about this fight that I don't like, and I can't really put my finger on it. Every time I fight against these guys, I just find them annoying, so I can't really place them higher. They can look pretty cool when they actually use the sword, but Seath once again falls into the category of disappointing dragon fights, where he mostly just stands still and does ineffective attacks around him, and you just hit his crystal ball sack until he dies. The Flexile Sentry is honestly a pretty bad fight overall, but I do give it some credit for having a unique design where, depending on where you're standing, he has a different moveset, like if you're in his front or in his back. That's cool. It's a cooler idea than it is an actual fight, but I think that deserves some credit, and the water rising during the fight adds a unique touch to it also. The Skeleton Lords are really just 3 basic skeleton mages that you kill, but I do at least like that depending which order you kill them in, you get different skeletons to spawn, so you have some type of a tactical element in this fight, even though you probably won't need it. The Deacons of the Deep fall in a very similar place. I think beating these dudes up is pretty funny when you have like a big weapon and you're just slaughtering them, but the fight against the main deacon itself is not even a fight at all. But I can't say I dislike this fight all too much, since there is that funny value of just bullying these dudes. There's not much I can say about the Keeper of the Old Lords. I was very tempted to put this dude in the not really a boss tier, but I can't really do that since there's that fight against them where you're at half health, so this dude is an actual threat. But they're a really basic hunter fight that spams pyromancy, and that's really all there is to it. Nasandra is a very nothing final boss. Like, she has almost no moves, she just spams those cursed orbs, and that's basically all her bag of tricks. At least the music's nice. The Crystal Sage is another magic spammer, but I think he might unironically be the best attempt they've done at a pinwheel style fight, but I still don't exactly like him all too much. The Demon of Song has an interesting design, but that's basically all that the fight really has. You're just waiting around for him to open the weak point, and then you whack him in the face and he falls over and dies. And some of his attacks have pretty questionable hitboxes, but hey, you know, Dark Souls 2. I do have to give some credit to the Vanguard since it's the first boss they ever did for these games. The fight basically boils down to you either slapping him in the ass 100 times or him one-shotting you. He's just very basic. Commander O'Neill is just forgettable as a fight, since there's another commander fight in the game who just has a lot more stuff going for him, so this guy kinda just gets left in the dust. It's rare to see Moon Presence actually do anything in the fight, since it's basically too weak to be Bloodborne's real final challenge. Like, typically it just dies before it gets off more than 1 or 2 moves. Gravelord Nito might be one of the most disappointing fights in the entire series, since his design is absolutely sick, but he's not exactly all that fun to fight 1v1, and if you're not fighting him 1v1, you're fighting a room full of skeletons. At least he can friendly fire those guys, and you have options on permanently killing them. The Dragonkin soldiers fall in a similar place for me as the Magma Worms, where they have things that look cool, especially the Frost Lightning stuff, but for some reason I just do not like these guys. Like, every time I fight them, I just find them very annoying to deal with. So the cool factor gets outweighed by my own annoyance with this one. The Bloodletting Beast just punches you, and then he uses a worm in his other fight. I don't really have much beyond that to comment. I've never been the biggest fan of Dark Beast Parl. If you fight them in the base game, you break their legs and then you just beat the shit out of them and they explode. And in the challenge dungeons, it's just a very tedious fight where you're fighting the camera half the time. The Blue Smelter Demon is in a weird place, since I think the Smelter Demon itself is a good fight, but then this guy is just the Smelter Demon again, but sometimes he can change his move timings, and he's at the end of one of the worst boss runbacks in the series. So, especially in any type of a challenge run, this dude can be really damn annoying. The Gaping Dragon has a sick design. Really cool. But that's the only really cool aspect of the fight, since he just aggressively walks at you and then you cut his tail off and kill him. The one reason why I put him on top of this tier is the inclusion of the mage on top of the sewer. If you leave him alive, he buffs the Gaping Dragon, but if you go kill him, then the Gaping Dragon's weaker. If the Gaping Dragon was an actual challenging fight, I think that could affect this even more. But it's nice that they reward exploration in this way. Alright, now we're moving on to the OK tier, where the bosses generally get more positive. There's always something with each of these fights where I think it ends up more on the positive side. I'd say this is probably my most controversial tier. Like, when I opened this up, you probably looked at a few of these like, what the fuck? But alright, hold on. Just let me cook, okay? Maiden Estrella was definitely very unique, since her whole gimmick is that you most likely never even fought this boss. You can just kill Garl of Vinland, and then Estrella just kills herself. And I think that's an interesting dynamic, but I could never place this boss any higher, since the actual fight portion of this whole experience is just a pretty boring NPC encounter. But the music, the atmosphere, and the entire story element of this fight definitely give it a boost. Mimic tier, out of all the goofy little gimmick side bosses in Elden Ring, I think deserves some credit for at least being a fun idea. Like them copying you, and you actually being able to exploit that by taking off all your gear. I think that's pretty funny. The run is just a big pile of goo that's pretty much just inoffensive. Avoiding the little fire pools in the room does make it a bit more interesting, so there's like an environmental hazard you have to look out for, so that's something. Mitha doesn't really have anything too special going for her. The most interesting thing she has is throwing her own head as a projectile and then using magic attacks with that. Like, that's neat. Fighting her in the poison pool is horrendous. Fighting her outside of it is kind of just, you know, okay. Alright, and when I was talking about controversial, this is basically what I meant. The Godskin duo gets hard carried by their soundtrack, which is one of the best in the series in my opinion. I love the music in this fight. But I think even as a duo fight, there's worse in Elden Ring already, as I mentioned, Valiant Gargoyles. Since this fight at least lets you utilize those pillars to separate them around and block their projectiles. The Godskin Noble's roly-poly attack is a pain in the ass, and that's the biggest downside to this fight overall. And it does feel a little lazy, since when you kill them, they can just revive each other even though they're both dead. Like, there's a lot going against this fight, and to be fair, if the music wasn't God tier, I definitely wouldn't be putting them in OK tier, but I have my biases. And if you only played this at launch, they did tweak their AI so they don't overlap their attacks as much these days. So it's also a little less annoying because of that. But speaking of gang fights, we got the Ruined Sentinels. Not too much to say about these guys, they're just dudes in armor, and at least From was generous enough to give us that little platform, so you most likely won't have to fight these guys 3v1. If the Headless Ape was in any other Souls game outside of like Sekiro, I think they'd be ranking lower, but since Sekiro has so many movement and combat options, I think you can somewhat play around this fight, even though it is a pretty lazy gank that they haven't really designed around being a like gank fight. But they do actually bring back the Maiden Astrea gimmick, where if you kill the Headless Ape first, the other one just gives up and loses their will to live. So hey, that's pretty cute. Throne Watcher and the Defender are basically just the original Godskin duo, since they do the same revive mechanic. But I'd say they're a bit more balanced overall. The reason why I give this fight the edge over the Godskins is that you can actually stop them from reviving if you just kill both of them around the same time. So that's a nice touch. The Armor Spider is not really too special. I think the remake did quite a bit for this fight, like visually. As far as these projectile spam bosses go, I think this one is mostly fine, since when you actually catch them, they do use melee stuff. There's different phases to this fight. It's you trying to approach them using melee, them pushing you away with the big explosion, or alternatively, you kill them when you get your hands on them. The Quelaag 2.0 here doesn't exactly improve on the original. Her biggest unique factor is the diving into the sand move, but that's more so a time waster than anything else. I don't know why they only put the Thumerian Descendant here and not the Elder, but I guess I'll mention both of them. The sword guy I think I like less than the staff teleporter guy, since the sword dude is pretty much just a spammer, while the Elder has a bit more of a dynamic fight. Osiris is a weird one, because I think I actually prefer phase 1, even though phase 1 is really easy. But phase 2 feels weirdly unpolished in a game that's famous for having really polished boss fights. The charge attack feels so janky that I'd say it alone brings this fight down quite a bit. The old Demon King kind of feels like he's the real Demon Fire Sage that we should have gotten, since this dude actually does fight like you'd expect a Demon Fire Sage to fight. I do like the touch of him having that kamikaze move at the end, so it gives him a bit of personality. I've had a bit of a soft spot for the Taurus Demon always, since you have the option to choose how you fight him. Do you fight him in the tower or on the bridge itself? I think that's a bit more flavor to a fight that could have been very basic. It's a shame that he gets downgraded to a basic enemy and spammed all across the Demon Ruins. Ilana is pretty hard to place, since her fight revolves so much around which summon she gets. Her own moveset is pretty much just magic spam, and she relies so much on just getting that one summon off. But on the other hand, it becomes a lot more exciting when Velstad is around, since it's not just her spamming magic or you dodging mostly ineffective skeletons. Dukester Freya, the big spider with two heads. I'd argue that the strongest part of this fight is actually a New Game Plus only feature, since weirdly enough she actually has a unique encounter in New Game Plus where you can fight her before the boss fight. I think that's a pretty big plus for her, since not many bosses get unique New Game Plus encounters. A Sound Demon is basic, but I think he serves his purpose as a tutorial and introduction boss. He has some memorable stuff, like him smacking you if you stand too long on the cliff doing the plunging attack. He introduces you to the idea of, hey, maybe you should come back to this later. You also do have the option of being a badass and killing him without him, but 99.9% of the people are not doing that. But all of this good stuff is also balanced out by the fact that purely as a fight, he is pretty much nothing. I was very tempted to put the Bloodhound Knights and the Black Knife Assassins into the quote-unquote not a real boss tier. But Black Knife Assassins does have Tish, who's more unique compared to the others. And the Bloodhound Knights are technically a story thing, since they're tied to Ronnie's storyline. So I decided to include both of these, and I think they're just okay as side bosses. Leonine Misbegotten falls in a somewhat similar place, but at least this dude is technically the end boss of a legacy dungeon. The fact that they can be basic enemies does kinda hurt them overall. Oh, Amygdala. Really cool design, cool face transition with them ripping off their arms, but I'd say the quality of this fight pretty heavily depends on the type of build you're using. Like, if your weapon can hit his head quite easily, then it can be a pretty fun fight. But if you're using a small baby weapon that can't reach him properly, this dude becomes really annoying to deal with. Executioner's Chariot is an interesting idea, with you having to basically survive a gauntlet to access the boss. The boss itself is kinda nothing, but I do like the concept of this fight, which is why I put it up here. The custom death animation with them falling into the pit is also a neat inclusion. I see a lot of people hate the Living Failures, but I've always found them to be okay. They're surrounded by some of the best bosses in the series, which makes them stand out as a bit of a lackluster inclusion. But their music and the mid-fight Cosmic Meteor thing definitely pushed these guys up quite a few slots for me. The Gravetender fight gets hard carried by the Wolf, since I think the NPC himself is nothing to write home about, but I like fighting the Wolf. I'd say the Wolf could even be in a good tier, but the NPC is just bad. Honestly, I put the Red Wolf or Radagon here mostly just so that the wolves are next to each other. Conceptually, it's a pretty cool fight, with it being like a magical dog that summons swords, and it's kind of like the Sif of this game, I guess, but unfortunately, this is another case where this becoming a basic enemy in a different area makes this fight less cool. And here we have a prime example of that, Estelle. Really cool design and introduction to this boss. It definitely stands out among the crowd until you find him again in a random mine, and now he has a different name. That alone hurts this fight immensely. The Iron Golem is just, it's a nice fight. I like that you can make him fall off the roof. I don't like it how easy it is for you to fly off the roof. I mostly like Priscilla for the fact that you don't actually have to fight her, and then her invisibility gimmick. Like, both of those are interesting. Like, she's pretty much up here just for how unique she is and not for her fight itself. Rennala was definitely a fight I liked more on my first playthrough, but repeat playthroughs kind of make her a bit more tedious, since she does spam a lot of magic and phase 1 is kind of nothing. But that phase 2 arena is just beautiful, and she is basically the head of the magic school, so it makes sense that she's using magic. So out of all the bosses, I can't really fault Rennala for being a magic spammer, because that's pretty much what she was destined to be. The Four Kings have a cool atmosphere. I wish you couldn't have more than 4 kings active. I think I would have liked it more if it was actually 4 kings, not them just respawning again and again. And the depth perception in the emptiness of the abyss can be a bit distracting, combined with their nearly infinitely homing magic attacks, which can end up being pretty annoying. So those are the reasons why I wouldn't put this boss higher. Then we have Mergo's Wet Nurse, which is, I think, almost too simple of a fight. I wish the phase 2 transition affected more. It's mostly just a phase 2 attack, not really a phase 2 transition. It's a real shame I have to put Lich Dragon Fortisac so low, since he looks really cool. Like, he has a really good soundtrack as well, and those big lightning attacks against in phase 2 are sick looking. But his lightning aura that triggers automatically when you're near him just makes the fight more tedious than it needed to be. And he's just too weak. He needed higher stats. Like, this guy often dies before he gets to really flex his muscles. Wart is just a genuinely solid early game boss. A few too many of his attacks can be avoided by just being under him, but he's okay. I'm not sure if I'd actually put these two next to each other, but I think it was funny to put the blind guy and the invisible boss next to each other. So we have the old hero and Ava. I like how in the old hero fight, if you're wearing light stuff or using the thief ring, you can kind of just bully him, since he's actually just a blind man and he can't find you. And if you're not doing that, then he actually can be a pretty aggressive fight. While Ava is pretty basic as a fight itself, I like that you have the option to beat them while they're invisible. That's really cool. It's a fun challenge to go through. Commander Nile is in an interesting place since I actually like fighting him quite a bit. I'd say the fight against Nile himself would definitely be in the good tier. But the summons in the beginning definitely bring it down a bit, since those two can wombo combo you from full health to no health even with endgame stats in like a second. Aldrich is in a weird place because I don't think the fight is all that special. They have some cool moves like the Life on Scythe and then the arrow attack, which is really dope looking. I don't know, there's just something about this fight that doesn't click for me and never really has, so I can't really put him any higher. And here's another one of my controversial takes. Gwyn works from a story perspective better than a gameplay perspective, since if you abuse parrying, he's a complete pushover, but then if you don't, I think he's almost too aggressive for Dark Souls 1. Like, it doesn't feel right when you compare him to other bosses in the game. I do like the plim plim plong, don't get me wrong. I don't hate fighting Gwyn, but he feels kinda unpolished. Now, the Elden Beast is interesting because if I made this list when Elden Ring came out, this too would have been in the bad tier 100%. But I've grown to appreciate it over time. I wish you could use torrent in it, but them toning down some of the bullshit like the, Elden Stars, and making Elden Beast a bit more aggressive, it doesn't fly away quite as much as he used to. I think that makes the fight a whole lot more better, but I really, really wish the Elden Beast and Radagon were separate fights. And then the final boss in this tier is the Corrupted Monk. Honestly, I wasn't sure where I'd place this guy, but there's a better version of this fight up the list. This guy doesn't really have much purpose, and it feels kind of like filler, but the filler is still good filler, so I can't really fault the fight too much. Alright, now we're moving on to the good shit. Starting off, Bell Gargoyles. Funny how they've done a fight like this quite a few times, like in Elden Ring, Dark Souls 2, Demon Souls, but I think this is the best version of like a gargoyle fight they've done. And it's just a classic. It's the first Dark Souls boss that I actually ever got stuck on, back when I first played the game, and it left a soft spot in my heart. So hey, these guys are cool. The Pursuer is interesting because I think him as a boss itself is pretty good. I like that you can parry him and shoot him with the ballistas. That's a nice touch. But I think the Scholar of the First Sin version of the game spams this dude way too much. I get it, he's supposed to pursue you, but I think he should have taken a few breaks. The fight itself is pretty good, especially for a Dark Souls 2 fight. Out of all the major horse bosses in Elden Ring, if you don't count the Knight's Cavalry, I think Loretta is my least favorite, since the Draconic Tree Sentinel, the Tree Sentinel typically try to stay a bit more up close and personal. Loretta is very happy with just spamming magic across the field. I wish they had her own music though. Them reusing a soundtrack for her makes her seem less special. The Godskin Noble could have honestly ranked even higher here if the rolling attack wasn't as janky as it is, especially in any type of a co-op playthrough. But that move is just such jank that I can't in good conscience put this guy any higher. But it's a pretty good fight, honestly. I'm not sure how people generally feel about the Blackblade Kindreds, but I personally kind of like him, especially the one that's near the Bestial Sanctuary, since that guy is like a wall. Like, you find him most likely pretty early on, and then after that point, he's gonna be just a wall for you, where you come back to him and you try to fight him and you realize, holy shit, he's still this strong? Like, I think that's a really interesting dynamic, and fighting them 1v1 is actually like decently fun. I definitely prefer the Axe version. I don't think the Twin Blade version I'd put in good. I'd say those are okay, but the Axe version is, in my opinion, definitely in the good tier. Draconic Tree Sentinel, another solid horse boss, this time with a lot more AoEs and lightning attacks. Not too much to say about this guy, I think it's just a pretty good fight. Then, more horse bosses. We have the dude who really likes to yell his name every time the fight begins. And he's solid. He's not anything too special. He's definitely on the more basic end when it comes to the Sekiro fights. But he's a good first main boss for the game. Lost Sinner, another Dark Souls 2 humanoid fight. I like that you can affect the arena, once again rewarding exploration by lighting up the braziers, and then you have better lock-on range and you can see the boss more clearly. That's a nice inclusion, and they're just a pretty solid knight fight overall. As is the next contender, Velstad, just a well-made knight fight with very satisfying bell sounds every time he swings his weapon. Yorm the Giant. I know a lot of people kind of hate this guy, since his gimmick is the Storm Ruler, and that has already been done before, and it makes the fight really easy. But I fought this guy normally as well, so I do like the fact that he is completely beatable, just 1v1, and he's not also like insanely tedious to do it that way compared to something like the Ancient Wyvern is. The Storm Ruler coming back, I think is cool, because I like that. I like the weapon. I like the whole use a special weapon to fight against one boss. Like, he is alright. I actually really like the old Dragon Slayer, even though I know it's basically just a rip-off of Ornstein. They did make some changes, and he doesn't play exactly the same. Plus, they actually fixed his charge attack, so he doesn't get stuck on things. So it's actually, in that sense, a bit more polished. But obviously, he's missing his backup dancer, so he's half the fight he typically is. Sanctuary Guardian, very aggressive boss, but I think it's a good introduction for the DLC, since a lot of the Dark Souls 1 DLC bosses are really aggressive. So I think this one is there to set the pace. And I like that this guy actually has a pretty big variety of moves for a Dark Souls 1 boss. Like, he has all kinds of different projectile attacks, he has wind attacks, he has specific attacks when they see you healing. Like, it's a pretty dynamic fight overall. Bloodstone Beast is a weird case because I technically like this fight quite a lot. It's a very intense boss fight, but I'm not a big fan of the poison aura they gain in the last phase, and also it's a little too easy to just circle strafe most of the moves this boss has. So even if I'd actually like to rank the Bloodstone Beast higher, due to those two things, I think around here is a pretty good spot. The Penetrator is pretty much the granddad of all the night bosses in these games. Like, purely mechanically, he's obviously not too special, but just for being the first boss of this type they ever did, I think they actually did a pretty good job with him. The Looking Glass Knight is just a solid knife fight, definitely one of the better of Dark Souls 2. The Ancestor Spirit and basically the Regal Ancestor Spirit as well, I'll basically just go over both. These are very majestic looking fights, and they're a visual spectacle from like a serene perspective. Eudex Gondir, one of the best tutorial fights they've done. He does a really good job setting you up for the rest of Dark Souls 3. Like, you learn to expect the bosses have wacky phase 2s, but it's a bit of a bummer that I don't enjoy fighting his phase 2 all that much. So this fight is definitely carried by the phase 1 just being really good. Ebrietas is another one of those cases where, in a way, I think the fight is actually a bit disappointing, which might sound weird considering how high she's on the list. It's a good fight. The music's good, definitely the atmosphere's good. And it's a nice, challenging secret boss. But it's another one of those fights where, depending on your build, you might just nuke her completely. So the quality of this boss is pretty much dependent on how well can you stagger her and how well can you hit her head. And she does have a few attacks that are a bit janky, like the charge attack, which sometimes feels like it's nearly impossible to dodge. Lady Butterfly, I'd say this is as middle of the road as the Sekiro boss can be, which says a lot about how good Sekiro bosses are. I don't have too many strong feelings about this fight, it's just good. Cleric Beast and Father Gascoigne set up an interesting dynamic that I think they follow up in the DLC, where they have a Beast fight and a Hunter fight in the very beginning, and I think Cleric fight does a good job setting up the other Beast battles of the game. The music is also top-notch, as the Bloodborne soundtrack often is. But the one reason why I wouldn't rank this even higher is that the camera can be your biggest enemy in this, and it can clip into the bridge. So that's the main reason why I'm not ranking Cleric Beast higher. The Falling Star Beasts are some of the better, like, common bosses from Elden Ring, especially the full-grown Falling Star Beast. Like, these dudes are just pretty cool to fight against. The gravity attacks are all nice looking, and the fact that you can stun them mid-charge if you hit them when they're like rushing towards you is really cool. Quelaag is not here just because of its opening cutscene, alright? I actually do like Quelaag as a fight. Like, spacing is so critical in this fight. Having to avoid all the lava and her sword swings. Like, there's a lot to like about this fight. Not just two things. Yharnam is an interesting fight. She's definitely unique. I think she functions well as the final boss of the challenge dungeons, but my main gripe with her is the automatic stun thing she does with the baby crying. Like, if you try to hit her too much, like, you basically get stunned and you have to go away from her. Phase 2 gets a lot more intense and I think more fun overall, so this fight gets kind of carried by the second half. I think the Watchdog is one of the better dungeon fights, as seen here. And a lot of people get soured on it, mostly due to the Defiled version, where you only have half health when you're fighting this guy. But that's not really a fault of the boss, it's more so a fault of the challenge that the game forces on you. But the Watchdog fight itself is, I think, pretty fun. I've always enjoyed fighting this guy. Emperor of the Briar is interesting since he's a really aggressive fight in a small space. but he uses his levitation sword to like reach you even when he's far away. But when you actually get his moveset timings down and you learn the dance with this guy, he's a really satisfying knife fight to fight against. I originally didn't like him too much, but the more I've played against them, the more I've learned to appreciate like how well this fight flows together. I kind of wish they actually didn't include this guy in the game at all, even though I do like fighting Godfrey. But just including him makes Godfrey actually seem a little less special. But I don't know, it's a simplified version of a really good boss. The Tower Knight is surprisingly dynamic for such an early game boss. Like, there's a lot going on in this fight, even though it doesn't really have multiple phases. You just either just shoot him in the head if you're a magic build, you go for his weak points right away, you hunt down the archer first. You have a lot of ways to tackle this guy, and I think he's a really cool boss. Shadows of Yharnam is definitely one of the better made gang fights they've done, since you have ways to separate them. Each of them kind of function differently. Like, one is mostly just a support, one is mid-range, one is close range, and the main reason why I didn't put him even higher is that the snake transformation, or like the final phase with the big snake attack, that thing can be kind of janky. Smelter Demon is definitely in the upper echelon of Dark Souls 2 bosses, and one of the few bosses where they actually utilize the life gem mechanic well, since you can fight his like fire aura. And yes, I did talk shit about the blue smelter, but that's mostly due to this guy actually being pretty cool, and the blue smelter is just a cheap ripoff where I don't think they add to the fight in any way that makes it better, and mostly just make it worse. I actually really like the Tree Sentinel, and I'm expecting them to do something similar with Shadow of the Erdtree, where you have a intro boss that's a roadblock if you want to fight him right away, or he becomes manageable if you go explore first and come back later. And the Tree Sentinel introduces that in a really good way. I also think these guys are just really fun to fight against. The Crucible Knights kind of fall in a similar place. They showcase a lot of the strengths of Elden Ring's combat system really well, where you can play around a lot of their tools in different ways. Like, you can jump over a lot of their stuff, you can parry these guys, you can dodge them, you can like guard counter them. In many ways, these dudes feel like a blueprint boss for a lot of the content in Elden Ring. But I do really like fighting them, even though there's quite a lot of these guys. Having this guy up here might seem really surprising, but I really like fighting the Erdtree avatars, because these guys are really clean and really fun to fight, and also highlight the strengths of Elden Ring, similar to Crucible Knight, where you can utilize jumping, you can utilize torrent, and all kinds of different tools to fight these guys. And I'm pretty much only talking about the Erdtree avatar specifically. I don't mean the Scarlet Rot versions, because those can be pretty tedious. The Flame Lurker and the Abhorrent Beast are kind of like brothers. Like, they're surprisingly similar in many ways. Like, Abhorrent Beast is a lot quicker, but Flame Lurker has AoEs, but their fights function in very similar ways. I definitely like the Flame Lurker's remake soundtrack. I know that's a controversial take, but I never was too fond of the original theme for him. But the main reason why I put the Flame Lurker lower is that magic builds can kind of just cheese him very easily, while the Abhorrent Beast always gives you a pretty good fight. So this guy's a bit more consistent compared to the Flame Lurker. The Divine Dragon is definitely a spectacle and a half, and one of the better fights of this style that they've done. But I honestly think he's a little too easy. They should have given him something that makes him a bit more of a threat, but he's still really cool. I've always really liked Vicar Amelia. To my knowledge, the #1 issue people have with this fight is her healing. And I guess people just don't know that you can use Numbing Mist on her and prevent her from doing that at all. Like, the Numbing Mist just stops the healing thing. My own biggest gripe with this fight is that she can sometimes kind of obscure your vision by being so fluffy. But I still really do like this boss. It's just, she's really satisfying to dodge. All of her like claw swipes that drag us across the floor, and her like big swings, like all of them are really satisfying to dash through. And as our final boss in the good tier, we have Sin, the Slumbering Dragon. Sin is just a generally solid dragon boss. It's a bit annoying that he breaks your weapon so easily when you're hitting him, and he does like to fly around quite a bit. I like that you can see this guy when you're going through the DLC, like they hype him up. And when you finally do fight him, it's a nice spectacle overall. So I think Sin is definitely one of the better dragon fights Fromsoft done, but absolutely not their best. Alright, now we're moving on to some real good shit. I'm guessing there's a few surprises here, for at least some people. Emma definitely gets overshadowed by the fight surrounding it. Like, there's potentially the Owl Shinobi fight and also the other Ishin fight. But she stands out quite well just on her own. I really like her music. And it's definitely a more somber fight compared to the others. So you're absolutely playing the villain in this fight, and it makes this whole thing feel a bit different compared to many of the other fights in the game. The Storm King. I'm gonna be honest, in the original Demon's Souls, this guy would not even land close to here. But the Demon's Souls remake elevated this boss more than anything else. And it might be one of the best audio-visual experiences that I've had in this gen. The fight itself is super simple. But just the sheer spectacle in the remake, the music, everything surrounding the fight is just so damn cool. Margit the Fell Omen definitely leaves an impression in the first playthrough. He's just a really great early game boss. He, at the same time, works well as a tutorial and also as a challenge. So yeah, I definitely like Margit, even though I prefer Morgoth. The Burnt Ivory King is definitely unique with the whole summoning your own army aspect of the fight, and I like how this technically got a sequel in the Dark Souls 3 mod where I fought Kreml, the Lord of Struggle, which was this fight but basically reversed. He's really cool. I know a lot of people love this fight, but I've never been like the biggest fan of it, but I do think it's a really tight fight. Here's the better version of the Corrupted Monk fight. One reason why I don't actually place this guy higher is that my favorite Sekiro fights are the ones where there feels like there's a back and forth. While in this fight, it feels more so like you're just parrying the boss until you get the stun off. It doesn't have that satisfying like back and forth cling clang style of fighting that I personally like the most in Sekiro. Godskin Apostle. If I'd have to pick one specifically, this is definitely the Khalid edition, since that's the most memorable one. As I've already mentioned with the other Godskins, the music is absolutely fantastic in this fight, and out of all the Godskins, the Apostle is definitely my favorite. I'm expecting that we'll probably see another Godskin in the DLC. Then we got Sif. What is there to really say about him? Sif is just really cool. Just his design is cool, the fight is very somber, and playing the DLC first only makes the fight better. Sif is a classic. He's very simple, but he's a classic. Dark Lurker is a surprisingly good duo fight, especially in Dark Souls 2. And I think it's my favorite base game boss. The biggest downside of the fight is honestly that it's so annoying to unlock, and actually reaching it is also a pain in the ass. Calamite I prefer over Sin, mostly due to how aggressive Calamite is. Like, he's very up close and personal, while Sin tries to zone you out. And I like that you have to do a side quest basically to even get a chance to fight him, since he's a dragon. Like, he can just fly, so you have to find a way to bring him down. That's really cool. Here's another controversial take, but I actually really like fighting Lawrence. And I think a lot of the people who like heavily dislike this boss, it's mostly just a skill issue. Like, even in phase 2 when he goes for that like 7-hit chain, like avoiding that is really satisfying. It requires very precise dodging and timing, but when you actually get the flow of him down, Lawrence is a really fun fight. Plus, and this is a big plus, I think Lawrence's music might be the best in all of these games. I love his theme music. Then we got Godric, Bearing Witness. He's a really good boss, but I think he should have actually been a bit harder. My main gripe with him is that you can really easily just curb stomp this guy without him being able to do a lot of anything, but he has a really cool moveset and definitely has a really cool design. Plus the cutscenes and voice acting do pump him up quite a bit. Martyr Ligarius is definitely a boss where phase 2 carries this fight pretty hard, because phase 1 is mostly just him spamming magic, and if he backs away so that his back is against the wall, he can become real tedious, since you can't really get around the spells all too easily. But phase 2 is really intense and fun to fight against, so I still rank him pretty high, even though phase 1 can sometimes be a bit of a nuisance. Guardian Ape is definitely a memorable encounter in your first playthrough. The death fake out is genuinely funny. It's nice that his phase 1 and 2 play completely differently. Like, phase 1 is just a wild beast fight, and phase 2 is like a very strange sword fight where all of his moves flow in a very unnatural way. But overall, this is just a really solid fight. Morgoth, the last of all kings. Pretty much just Margit 2.0, I think is overall better. I wish his stats were a bit higher, so he wouldn't die so easily in phase 2. It's rare to see him really get to show his stuff, so this guy often shines the most during challenge runs, I think. Pontiff Sullivan, definitely a cool boss. Once again, one of the more unique takes on a duo fight, with him using his shadow clone, becoming a stand user basically. But at the same time, the clone is also my biggest downside for this fight, since he's supposed to replicate the moves that his clone does, but sometimes their sync breaks, and they do different stuff, or they do attacks in a way where they're practically impossible to dodge, and that's a bit annoying. But when this fight works how it's intended, it's a really damn good boss. Dancer of the Boreal Valley definitely does feel unique, since it does feel more like a dance than a sword fight. And when you get the rhythm down and everything's flowing smoothly, she's a very satisfying boss to fight against. It's a bit of a shame how bad she gets cheesed by spells and projectiles, since she doesn't really have any answer to that type of a playstyle. But she's still really great, and I like that you can fight her early to unlock late game stuff before you're supposed to. I've always really liked Old King Allant. He's pretty simple if you look at him with like modern standards for these games. But back then, like, he has a really big moveset for a Demon Souls boss, and him taking away your levels with that grab is one of the most evil things these games have ever done. So he's definitely a memorable fight, and I think he's the best boss from Demon Souls. I also like that they use a different version of the game's main theme as like his boss music. Fume Knight is probably the most famous boss from Dark Souls 2, and I think he's just extremely good. But I also don't think he has anything that's special enough to put him in the amazing tier. A lot of people might be surprised to see Malekith this low, since this is a boss that's commonly put in like top 10 for some people. But the main reason for this is called the Beast Clergyman. I'm not the biggest fan of Phase 1 at all, and I kinda just wish Phase 2 was the whole thing and he just had more health. Phase 2 really does pop off though, so as a combined package, I can't say that it isn't really great. As is our final spot from the great tier, Ornstein and Smo. I was so close to including them in Amazing, and I really would have liked to, just, you know, because they're a classic. They're what everyone thinks when someone talks about duo fights in these games, and a lot of people say these dudes are the best to this day. I don't agree with that, since Ornstein's charge move is so glitchy. Like, that's the main reason why I wouldn't put them like in the highest tier, but overall it's just a classic fight. What else is there to say that hasn't already been said? It's ONS. Basically, when I started making this list, for any boss that's in the amazing tier, I thought to myself, do I like them more than Sir Alon? If I do, they make it into the tier, and if I don't, they go in the grade. So that was pretty much how I thought about it, since I think this is the perfect gatekeeper for this tier. But the main reasons that push this guy over the line is the music, the presentation, and the whole seppuku gimmick that they added in. Like, that's such a cool inclusion that there's like a built-in challenge run where you have to beat the boss no hit to unlock like a secret death animation. It's not a lot, but it adds so much to how this fight feels. And it's something that no other boss in the series has done since. Next, we have Ishin Ashina, who is just the lesser version of the Ishin boss. He mostly just has his Phase 1 moveset from the Sword Saint fight, but he does a few special attacks here and then. Compared to the main event that comes later, he's definitely the weaker version of the two. Next up we have Mr. Gascan himself, Father Gascoigne. One of the best early game fights they've ever done. Does an extremely good introduction to the hunter fights of the game. This fight basically tells a little story, with Gascoigne losing his humanity and becoming a beast, and then there's the whole storyline with his family that's also a part of it. And there's just a lot going on, both in the gameplay and in the narrative. Next up, Godfrey and Horalu, another boss that many people rank near the very top of their list, but I don't think Horalu is as good as Godfrey. Don't get me wrong, his wrestling moves are really cool, but there's just something about Godfrey where he feels very deliberate in his moves, while Horalu feels a bit more spammy in a lot of his like melee combos. Personally, I wouldn't put Horalu in Amazing, but I definitely would put Godfrey up here. Then after that, we got Genichiro, the tutorial version. Note, not the one from the middle of the game. In New Game Plus, he's completely manageable, but in New Game, pretty much everyone's getting folded by this guy. At least the first time they play. On repeat playthroughs, he is manageable. He's basically just a simplified version of the real fight that we get later, so I can't rank him as high as the real boss fight, but he's still fundamentally Genichiro, and Genichiro is my boy. Rykard is my favorite version of a quote-unquote spectacle or gimmick fight that they've ever done. He's definitely the coolest, and the mid-fight transition and the entire presentation of the fight is top-notch. An absolutely badass boss fight. Champion Gundyr, this dude is just relentless. He's like a turbocharged version of the basic Eudex Gundyr fight, and he actually pulls out fighting game juggle combos on you if you get hit by certain attacks. So this dude is just a really badass and fun fight. Manus is my second favorite fight from Dark Souls 1, and he's definitely elevated by the inclusion of Sif as a part of the fight. He's one of the only times where I think using summons makes the fight better in a way, Like, there are a lot of ways to change this fight. You also have the pendant. So you could fight this guy with no pendant at all without Sif, or you could use the pendant and use Sif and make him a lot more manageable. So once again, a boss that rewards exploration, a boss that's challenging, and also just a really intense fight to end the DLC. Demon of Hatred. A lot of people have a lot of hatred for this boss, but this is the case where I think it's actually just a skill issue, because the game gives you so many tools that are specifically good for this fight. You have a completely fireproof shield, you can stun him, you can use a grappling hook. This is a fight all about using all of your tools and momentum. Like, you can get around this guy by sprinting. You don't even have to dodge this dude. You can just sprint around a lot of his attacks. It's a very drawn out fight, but it's also a fight where you get to utilize a lot of the tricks you've learned during the game. So I've always really liked the Demon of Hatred. If you struggle with this fight, you should try to utilize movement more and just staying in motion, and also putting the shinobi tools to better use. General Radahn, one of the better fights of Elden Ring. This fight is an absolute spectacle. You get to summon your own army, he becomes a fucking meteor and starts flying around. And he has definitely gotten more easier over time, but I'd argue that those nerfs that he got also ironed out some of the more rough elements, since he had some pretty questionable hitboxes and tracking on some of his attacks. So I think Radahn has landed at a pretty good place here. Dragon Slayer armor is the most underrated fight in Dark Souls 3. I've seen a lot of people say that this is a copy of Ornstein and it's a lazy fight, but in terms of the mechanics, they have zero things that resemble each other. So my only gripe is that the Phase 1 music is a lot better than Phase 2, but it never gets to play out because Phase 1 goes by too quickly. But this fight is an absolute blast. Next up, Great Shinobi Owl. It's definitely the least exciting of the owl fights, but still, it's the owl fight. The mid-fight fake out where he pretends to give up is also really funny. Next, Placidusax. Originally, when I first played through Elden Ring, this guy was my favorite boss in the game. Now he has fallen off a little bit, not too much, but I still really like fighting this guy. He's easily the best dragon boss from Elden Ring, and the pure cinematic factor of this fight is pretty much unmatched. Like, he goes nuts in Phase 2 and 3 with his like teleportations and the cloud attacks and the lasers and everything. The biggest downside is also exactly that. He can spend a lot of time just flying away from you instead of engaging you directly. But luckily he is really cool, so I personally don't mind it too much. Next up we got the OG himself, Knight Artorias. He has stood the test of time. He's still basically the gold standard for what a knight boss should be in these games, and a lot of bosses have taken clear inspiration from him. And what else is there to say? He's Artorias. Mohg is probably the boss where I've changed my opinion the most since I first played the game. Like, I wasn't the biggest fan of Mohg, either version of him, but over the time, and especially during my Soul Level 1 playthrough, I've learned to really like this guy. His moveset is really weird, but when you actually get the hang of it and his like swing timings, he becomes extremely satisfying to play against. And yeah, the mid-fight Nihil thing is at the same time really cool, and also a bit cheap if you don't know how to counter it, but there is counterplay to that with the one item. But overall, I do think Mohg is a damn good boss. Next up, Orphan of Cause. Probably the most infamous Bloodborne boss, and I've personally experienced some of that infamy during my Blood Level 4 challenge, where this dude beat my ass like 100 times. But Orphan is an insanely intense boss. Like, this guy doesn't pump the brakes until he's dead on the floor. And it's funny how it's literally just a big screaming baby, and it puts up one of the most intense battles from the entire series. It says a lot about how good the bosses in the Bloodborne DLC are, when this guy is only my third favorite and he's this good. The Demon Prince is, in my opinion, the best gank fight From has ever done. The dynamic where the two demons switch which one has the powered up form, and then depending which you kill first, they do the Ornstein Osmo thing, and you get a different Phase 2 depending. It takes a lot of ideas from other bosses, but it executes them very well. And even though I said this is the best gank fight they've done, Sister Frida, another DLC boss, overall I think is stronger. These are very similar bosses where both of them have a tag team phase that leads into like a powered up 1v1 phase. But Frida has the advantage of having 3 unique phases. Black Flame Frida goes pretty nuts in the final one. And yeah, Frida is just great, and so is the Demon Prince. Ever since I first played both of these bosses, I've basically put them side by side on every list I've ever thought about. So I see them as sort of a package deal. Next up, the Soul of Cinder, the final boss of Dark Souls 3's base game. It's basically you versus the entire player base, plus then Gwyn at the end, and it's a better version of the Gwyn fight. And it brings back the Pling Pling Plong as well. So this is just a really good capping off point for the entire Dark Souls series. Gehrman, the First Hunter. Back in the day, this guy used to be my favorite boss. He's fallen down quite a bit now, but that's mostly due to just From getting better with their bosses. I like the way he switches his weapon during the fight and goes into different forms and adds quite a bit of variety to how the fight functions overall. And he's just a really damn good hunter fight. He goes through multiple phases, the music's fantastic, the entire atmosphere and the arena itself is just spectacular. The one small downside is that if you do the DLC first before fighting him, he becomes a bit too easy. But if you fight him at the end of the base game, then at that point I think he's perfectly balanced. And I think he's generally a pretty perfect capping off point for the whole game, if you take that ending. Then we got the Abyss Watchers. It's actually pretty rare to see someone put the Abyss Watchers higher than Artorias, but I've always preferred fighting them. Like I said, Demon Prince is my favorite gank fight specifically, but I don't really see Abyss Watchers as a gank all that much, since it can technically be a 2v2, since you get your own little guy to help you. And phase 2 of this fight is extremely fun to fight against. I love the music, I love the atmosphere. Like, if this fight had more health, I could actually see myself putting these guys in my top 10. But since this is a mid-game boss, they often die a bit too soon for you to be able to enjoy the fight properly. So honestly, I wish this fight was harder. It's actually my, I think, 5th. Yeah, I put it as my 5th favorite Dark Souls 3 boss, and I think that's about right. I am Malenia, the Blade of Miquella, probably the most controversial fight from Elden Ring, since most likely people start hating this fight and then you learn to love it over time. Like, there's a lot to like about it. She is an insanely satisfying boss when you actually learn to fight her. Main issue for a lot of people is the waterfowl dance. Yes, there's counterplay to that, but it's kinda annoying how so much of this fight revolves around that one move that she can just pull out at any moment. But overall, Malenia is an absolute blast to fight against. I love that she's actually as difficult as she is. Like, Malenia was an experience where the whole fan base had to get good again, because she beat the shit out of everyone. Nemesis King has definitely made a name for himself over the years, but I think this is one of those fights where if you actually go replay this after Elden Ring, you realize how easy he is to read. And at the same time, I think that's one of the reasons why I like him so much, because his moveset is very telegraphed. Like, he's not spamming attacks, he's always very deliberate, and he's just a really damn cool boss. Like, you're fighting a god on top of thunderclouds, like, it's just a spectacle. Phase 1 is not that special, but it goes by so quickly since you kill the dragon in a few taps, so the real event is the Phase 2. As long as you don't run under the dragon, camera is not too big of an issue, so I don't mind Phase 1 enough so that I'd put this boss any lower. As I mentioned before, I really love fighting Genichiro. This fight shows what Sekiro's combat system is all about, and this guy is just super satisfying to fight against. I don't really have any big complaints. I basically like this fight more every time I replay the game. And finally, Radagon. I kinda wanna put this guy in my top 10, since every time I see that opening cutscene for this guy, I get chills. Like, he's so fucking cool, but this fight technically doesn't exist, since it's Radagon and Elden Beast. And I wouldn't put Radagon and Elden Beast in my top 10. If they had a Radagon fight where they just expanded this, or if he was the final boss of one of the endings and Elden Beast was like a secret boss, maybe in that timeline this dude was in my top 10, but currently he is my favorite boss in Elden Ring, but I just wish he got to be a boss on his own and he wasn't forced to dance with a different dance partner. And here we finally have my top 10. Let's start things off with Dark Eater Midir. Another one of those bosses where I think the fan base collectively just has a skill issue with this boss, but at least over the recent years people have finally learned that you actually have to fight the boss by being in front of him. Every time I see a guide or anyone play against this boss and I see them hitting this dude's legs, I'm gonna cry right then and there, because fighting Midir, like face to face, head to head, is one of the most satisfying experiences in these games. All of his attacks and animations, especially the big laser attacks, are so sick looking. Kind of like Nameless King, he has one of the most telegraphed movesets in the game, where he's really easy to read if you just don't run under him. This dude is such a satisfying boss, and it's easily my favorite dragon boss that they've done. Next up, as I've already mentioned, I really love fighting Genichiro, so we got Inner Genichiro, which I think is just the best version of his fight. The few added moves and changes to his existing moveset just make him more fun to fight against and much more of a challenge to fight against. The cherry on top of this beautiful cake is him reversing your lightning reversal, which definitely will catch you off guard the first time he does that. But this guy is so fun to fight against. I've always really liked the Twin Princess fight. Their teleport and the entire dynamic of the fight, with Lorien just being like a cripple that gets teleported around by his brother, and them doing the piggyback combo. This fight just has a really nice flow to it, where you're weaving between Lorien's teleport attacks and then when they bring in the magic in phase 2. Like, it all works so damn well. The music and the mid-fight cutscene are also definitely standouts. I think the music is one of my favorites in the game, especially because the way the choir kicks in phase 2 when the fight ramps up just takes it to a whole nother level. Like, I just love this fight. The number 7 spot goes to Owl Father, Daddy Dearest. As I mentioned before, the Owl fight is already amazing, and this is just an improvement on it. Like, this guy does a really good job highlighting how many different tools you can use in this game. Like, there's a reason why Owl Father is a pretty common boss to see in those like Sekiro style videos. Like, this dude is absolutely sick, and he's such a satisfying fight. The next two are pretty much tied for the number 6 and 5 spots. We have Ludwig and Maria. I think, as I said, Cleric Beast and Father Gascoigne form like a nice duo in the beginning of the game, where there's like a hunter fight and a beast fight, and I think this does something similar, but this time it's the best beast fight of the game that then turns into a sword fighter in the second half with the Moonlight Greatsword, and then Maria offering the best hunter fight of the game. Ludwig using the Moonlight Greatsword in phase 2 and that cutscene, probably the coolest they've ever done. Lady Maria using her own blood to attack you and then the blood fucking explodes. Like, these fights are just peak. And back when the DLC first came out, these were easily my number 1 and 2 favorites. Until certain other bosses came and overtook those spots, including Ishin the Sword Saint and Inner Ishin. These are fundamentally pretty much the same fight. Ishin the Sword Saint just has Genichiro in the beginning, so it technically has 4 phases, and it's the defining boss of Sekiro. Hesitation is defeat. Inner Ishin removes Genichiro from the beginning, but then they give him new stuff that force you to play the fight a little differently and force you to react in ways that I don't think many bosses even make you do. Like, I don't think air parrying is something you have to do a lot, but Inner Ishin makes you do that. So I think Inner Ishin is just a more refined version of the Sword Saint fight, but it's not like a huge improvement. They're basically neck and neck. And then we reach the guy who's typically everyone's number 1, Slave Knight Gale. I wasn't sure which of these last two I'd pick as my favorite, and I basically let my most recent playthrough decide which would be my number 1. And here we have Gale as number 2. He's the perfect ending to the Dark Souls series. Like, the two nobodies fighting over nothing in the middle of nowhere. That's pretty much it. But then one of those guys ends up using the power of God and anime, both at the same time. There are plenty of reasons why people pick this as their favorite fight. Like, the arena is probably my favorite in the series, the music is really good. Just the whole atmosphere of the fight and all of his different phases having different types of moves, like, Gale just has it all, honestly. Even though it's my number 2, this is still among my favorite bosses in any video game. And the only one that I'd put above him, the only one I even thought about putting above him, like, nobody else was even in the competition for number 1 spot. Except Inner Father. In a way, the most underrated fight in all of these games, since a lot of people have never fought against this guy. But imagine Owl Father, but he's on crack. That's pretty much it. This is Owl Father going 110%, just teleporting around the arena, pulling out all the tricks. Like, this is the other fight you see in those like Sekiro style videos, because this fight is just absolutely fantastic. The flow and the feel of this fight is unmatched by anything that From has ever done. There have been times when I booted up Sekiro just to fight this boss to remember how good this is. He's that good. And if you have never played against this boss, absolutely do yourself a favor. Install Sekiro before the Shadow of the Erdtree comes out and just unlock this fight, go fight him, and learn why I'm glazing this dude up so much. But that's my list. Jesus Christ, I'm starting to lose my voice. That's pretty much the whole thing. It's probably scrolling on the screen right now. I did make a few last minute changes to the list overall, mostly to the bottom half, since I was much less confident about that. And no bosses changed tiers or anything, they're still in the same area. I pretty much just shuffled the order around a little bit in a few places, so it's mostly still the same. Just like with every tier list, this was just my opinion. You can post yours below, but just remember, of course, this was the objectively correct list. Miyazaki himself said so, he actually approved my list, sorry to tell you this, but it is what it is. I hope Shadow of the Erdtree is full of stuff that I can put into this screen, and less stuff that I can put below this screen. But yeah, that about wraps it up. Only one more thing left to do.